Okay, so listen up, because this whole thing, it didn't even start as a fight over trade. It started with one big, bold accusation, so bold, so carefully planned, that within just a few hours, it started shaking one of the closest friendships in today's world. The United States has officially started a forced labor investigation, and the target is Canada. Let that land for a second. Not China, not some country under sanctions, Canada. And what happened after that? Nobody in Washington saw it coming. Mark Carney didn't stay quiet. He didn't sneak off into some back room to handle it privately. He stepped right up and stepped forward, and what he said, like word for word, and what he's actually doing right now, could turn this into the most explosive U.S.-Canada showdown we've seen in a very, very long time. Stay with me, because the more you dig into this story, the more obvious it all becomes. This isn't really about labor at all. It's about power, it's about control, and it's about a plan that could completely change how trade works in North America, right now, in real time. Okay, so let's lay it all out, because the order things happened in really matters here. Just 72 hours ago, the U.S. Commerce Department officially started a formal investigation using something called Section 307 of the Tariff Act, and the target, Canadian aluminum, softwood lumber, and farm products coming across the border. The reason they gave? Possible connections to forced labor. On the surface, that sounds like normal government stuff, like routine paperwork. But the second you look a little deeper, the whole story starts falling apart. Canada is not a country famous for mistreating its workers. Actually, by most global standards, Canada scores better than the United States when it comes to protecting workers, the strength of unions, and how much people get paid. So why Canada, and why right now? Here's where it starts to get a little uncomfortable. This investigation didn't just randomly appear out of thin air. It came right after weeks of Donald Trump ramping up his language and calling Canada an economic threat at his rallies. He didn't just talk about trade being unfair. He went further. He said Canadian industries were hurting American workers by using what he called questionable labor practices. That specific phrase is important because 2 weeks later, people inside his own administration started using the exact same words. Then came news of private conversations about checking supply chains and specifically looking at products coming from Canada. And now here we are, a full investigation built on exactly that idea. But here's the part that flips everything on its head. According to multiple people who know about these behind-the-scenes trade talks, this investigation might not actually be about proving anyone did anything wrong. It might just be about creating enough doubt and confusion to mess up Canadian exports at a really important moment, right before the 2026 review of the USMCA trade deal. Think about the timing here. Canadian aluminum companies really need their American customers. Softwood lumber is deeply tied into the U.S. housing business. Farm goods cross back and forth across the border every single day. You don't have to actually prove anyone did something bad to cause serious damage. All you have to do is ask the question. Because once that question is out there, buyers get nervous, orders get pushed back, contracts get looked at again, supply chains start moving around, and the damage starts happening way before any official decision is ever announced. And that's exactly what's already going on. Within just 48 hours of the announcement, Canadian sellers started saying their American partners were getting cold feet. Some orders were put on hold, others were quietly sent somewhere else. Millions of dollars in trade didn't completely stop. It just slowed down just enough to create pressure. And pressure in trade politics is everything, because it forces the other side to do something. It forces them into a spot where doing nothing looks like they're being weak. But here's where Washington totally miscalculated. They expected a calm, careful response, maybe a polite statement, some quiet talks behind the scenes. That's how past Canadian leaders handled trade tension. Calm, controlled, handled in private. But this time, things went differently. This time, the response came from Mark Carney, and within hours, he completely changed the energy of the whole situation. Carney didn't just say the accusations were wrong, he flipped the whole thing. In a statement that spread all over international news within minutes, he accused the United States of using human rights language as a weapon to get economic advantages. He didn't soften it at all. He didn't water it down. He called it exactly what he thinks it is, a politically motivated move dressed up as a moral concern to justify trade restrictions. And then he did something even smarter. He turned the whole argument right back at the United States. Because here's the reality that makes this whole situation so explosive. The United States has a prison labor system that, under its very own constitution, allows people in prison to work for extremely low wages. That's not someone's opinion. That's actual policy. And Carney used that fact as a legal argument, not just as a dig or a comeback, but as a real legal counterpoint. If the U.S. is going to open the door to forced labor investigations, then Canada can walk right through that same door and look at American products using the exact same rules. That's the moment this stopped being a one-sided investigation and started looking like a possible trade war. And now the situation is moving into a whole new stage, because behind all the public statements, behind all the news headlines, both sides are already getting ready for their next moves. Lawyers are getting to work, trade officials are running through different scenarios, industries on both sides of the border are getting ready for things to get rough, and the most important detail of all, none of this has officially blown up yet. No tariffs have been put in place, no final decisions have been made. Everything happening right now is in that tense space right before the explosion. Which means the real question isn't what's already happened. The real question is what's coming next. Now here's where this stops just being political drama and becomes something much more calculated and deliberate. Because what Mark Carney did next wasn't just hitting back, it was a counterstrike designed to hit the United States exactly in the spot it didn't see coming. Within hours of the U.S. announcement, Carney gave the go-ahead for Canada to start putting together its own investigation into American products. Not symbolic, not just talk, a real, legal, properly structured probe looking at U.S. farm goods. And the focus? Whether any products coming into Canada have any connection to the prison labor system inside the United States. Just take a moment with that. The exact same legal tool Washington used against Canada is now being pointed right back at Washington. This completely changes the whole dynamic because the United States didn't just open an investigation, it opened a door. And once that door exists, anyone can walk through it both ways. Here's why that actually matters. The American prison labor system isn't some secret. It's all documented. Over 800,000 people in prison take part in work programs across different industries. In some cases, the things they make end up in regular commercial supply chains. So the moment Canada starts asking whether any of those products are coming into its market, the whole conversation changes instantly. It's no longer just about claims and accusations. It becomes about real, checkable, provable exposure. It becomes about actual evidence, and this is where the strategy becomes crystal clear. Carney isn't just trying to win a news cycle. He's trying to put the United States in a position where continuing the investigation against Canada becomes politically and legally awkward, because if Washington keeps pushing, it risks putting its own system under the exact same kind of international spotlight. But the counterattack doesn't stop there. At the same time, Canada is getting ready to officially file a dispute under the USMCA agreement. This is not a small step. This is a formal legal process that can lead to authorized retaliation. If Canada files under Chapter 31, it kicks off a panel review that could decide whether the U.S. investigation breaks the rules of the trade deal. And here's the key part. If Canada wins that case, it earns the legal right to hit back with tariffs. We're talking targeted economic payback. American steel, American cars, American farm exports, entire industries that count on Canadian buyers could suddenly face new walls. And unlike just a political reaction, these actions would be protected by the very trade deal that the United States helped create and signed off on. Now think about the pressure building up quietly behind the scenes. American farmers count on Canada as one of their biggest customers. Billions of dollars in goods flow north every single year. The auto industry is even more fragile than that. The supply chains between the two countries are so deeply tangled together that one single part might cross the border multiple times before a car is even finished. Disrupt that flow even a little, and the ripple effects multiply really fast. That's why, behind closed doors, business leaders in the United States are already reacting quietly but with real urgency because they understand something that political headlines usually miss. Trade wars don't stay in one lane. They spread. They hit industries that had nothing to do with the original fight. And once supply chains start moving away, pulling them back is incredibly hard. But here's where the tension really cranks up. Because while the economic risks are getting louder, the political motivations are pushing in the completely opposite direction. For Donald Trump, this confrontation fits perfectly into a bigger strategy, painting foreign competition as a threat to America, making the United States look like it's being taken advantage of, and building a story where going hard looks like strength. In that kind of story, backing down is not an option because backing down doesn't just change a policy, it changes how people see you. And in this kind of political environment, how people see you drives absolutely everything. So now you've got two forces moving at the exact same time. Economic reality pushing toward calming things down, political momentum pushing toward more conflict. And right in the middle of that collision are millions of workers, businesses, and industries that need things to stay stable between these two countries. But the most important detail right now is this. Neither side is showing any signs of slowing down. Canada is escalating through legal channels. The United States is holding its ground publicly. And every single hour that passes without a resolution makes it more likely that this moves from just an investigation to actual action. Because once tariffs come into the picture, once restrictions stop being just a possibility and start being real, the situation doesn't just get more intense, it locks in. And that's exactly the moment both sides are now getting close to. Now here's where this gets even more serious, because what's happening right now isn't just a legal fight or a political back and forth. It's a slow-moving economic shock that's already starting to hurt real industries on both sides of the border. And the scariest part? It's happening before any official decision has even been made. Let's start with aluminum, because this is the very center of it all. Canada is one of the biggest suppliers of aluminum to the United States. Not a small player, a critical partner. Whole American manufacturing sectors depend on steady supply from Canada. Aerospace, cars, construction, all of it. And within 48 hours of the investigation being announced, Canadian producers started noticing something very specific. Not cancellations, not flat-out rejection, hesitation, orders being delayed, contracts being looked at again, buyers suddenly asking questions they weren't asking just 1 week ago. And in global trade, hesitation is often worse than rejection because hesitation creates uncertainty, and uncertainty freezes everything. Now think about what that actually feels like for a Canadian aluminum worker. You're part of a union, you're making a steady paycheck, your industry has a long, solid relationship with American buyers, and then overnight your product gets tied to forced labor accusations. Not proven, not verified, just connected by association. That reputational hit alone is enough to mess everything up, but aluminum is just the start. Softwood lumber is where this gets even more complicated, because this isn't a new fight. It's a cycle, a pattern that goes back decades. Every time economic pressure builds up in the United States, Canadian lumber becomes the target. Tariffs, quotas, investigations, different tools, same result every time. Protection for U.S. producers at the cost of Canadian exports. But this time there's a brand new layer added on top of all that. Forced labor. And that completely changes how people see it, because now it's not just about money and competition. It's about ethics. It's about whether something is morally okay. And once you bring that into a trade fight, the damage goes much deeper. American home builders depend heavily on Canadian lumber to keep their costs manageable. There's no realistic way for U.S. domestic production to fully replace that supply. So if this investigation slows down imports, prices don't just nudge up a little, they spike hard. Housing costs go up, construction takes longer, and suddenly a policy that was supposed to protect workers ends up making everyday life more expensive for regular Americans. That's the contradiction sitting right at the heart of all of this. Now let's talk about farming, because this is where the political consequences start getting impossible to ignore. Canada is one of the biggest buyers of American farm goods. Billions of dollars every year, corn, soybeans, dairy, meat, whole rural communities in the United States depend on that relationship. And the second Canada even starts talking about possible countermeasures, those industries start feeling the nerves because they've been through this before. They know how fast access to a market can just disappear. And right now, behind the scenes, farming groups in the United States are already raising alarms, quietly but clearly, because if Canada actually follows through with tariffs or restrictions, the hit won't be something you see in a future projection. It'll be immediate: lost contracts, too much supply and not enough buyers, falling prices. And those effects don't just sit in spreadsheets. They hit actual farms, they hit actual families, they hit actual communities that are already barely making it. But here's where things get even more layered, because while the economic warning signs are flashing everywhere, the political messaging is doing the exact opposite. For Donald Trump, this whole situation backs up a story he's been building for months. The idea that other countries, even close friends, are taking advantage of the United States, that American workers are being undercut, and that going on the offensive is the only right move to make things fair again. And when that message reaches voters, it doesn't show up with economic charts or data about supply chains. It shows up with feelings. It shows up with frustration. It shows up with the sense that someone is finally standing up and fighting back. That's why this is so hard to walk back, because from a purely numbers and economic standpoint, both sides have very good reasons to step down. The risks are obvious, the costs can be measured, the damage is predictable. But from a political standpoint, stepping back looks like losing, and losing in this environment is simply not something anyone can afford. Meanwhile, on the other side, Mark Carney is dealing with a completely different kind of pressure. His response isn't only about trade, it's about proving something. It's about showing that Canada will not sit back and accept accusations that hurt its workers and industries when there's no real evidence behind them. And so far that approach is actually working back home. Public support for Carney is going up, political pushback against him is shrinking. Even groups that normally fight each other are getting behind the same message: Canada will push back. That kind of unity changes the math entirely, because it tells Washington that this isn't just a quick emotional reaction. It's a serious and lasting position. And when both sides dig into positions that are politically locked in, the space for finding a middle ground starts to disappear. Which brings us to the most important point of this whole section: the economic damage you're seeing right now. This is the early part. No tariffs have been put in place yet. No final rulings have been issued. No actual penalties exist yet. And still, trade is already slowing down. Confidence is already getting shaky. Decisions are already being pushed back. Now just picture what happens if this actually moves to the next level. Because once real actions replace warning signals, everything speeds up fast. Now take a step back for a second, because what we're watching isn't just a fight between two countries. It's something way bigger than that. This is about how the entire system of global trade is starting to bend under pressure. And if you really get this part, you'll understand why this whole situation feels so different from anything we've seen before. For decades, the relationship between the United States and Canada has run on one basic assumption: stability. Yeah, there were disagreements. Sure, tariffs were put in place at times. But underneath all of that, there was a shared understanding that the rules meant something, that agreements like NAFTA and later USMCA created a framework that both sides would respect, even when things got tense. That assumption is now being tested out in the open, in real time. Because what Donald Trump has done with this forced labor investigation is throw something way more unpredictable into the mix. He's blurred the line between actual enforcement and pure strategy, between a real concern and political leverage. And once that line gets blurry, every country watching starts asking the same thing. If this can happen to Canada, it can happen to anyone. That question is already spreading way beyond North America. Officials in Europe have started signaling that they stand with Canada's position and are emphasizing that trade enforcement has to be based on actual evidence. Trade partners in Asia are quietly checking their own exposure to similar moves, because this isn't just about one investigation. It's about whether trade rules are still actually rules or whether they've become tools that can be picked up and used whenever it's convenient. And if they've become tools, then every country in the world needs a backup plan. And that's exactly where Mark Carney is steering all of this. Because while the headlines are all about the big, loud confrontation, the real strategy is quietly unfolding behind the scenes. Carney isn't just defending Canada. He's reframing this entire situation as a test case for global trade reliability. His message is simple but powerful. If the United States can launch a politically motivated probe against one of its closest friends without clear evidence, then no trade relationship anywhere in the world is truly safe. That message lands hard not because it sounds dramatic, but because it puts uncertainty into a system that absolutely depends on things being predictable. And once uncertainty gets into the equation, countries start adjusting. They start spreading their supply chains around. They start looking at other markets. They start pulling back their dependence on any single partner, even one as massive as the United States. Now think about what that means over time. American economic power was never just about being big. It's always been about position, being at the center of global trade, being the reliable partner that everyone connects to, the default hub. But if countries start questioning that reliability even a little bit, the shift doesn't happen all at once. It happens slowly, quietly, one decision at a time. A company chooses to buy from a different country. A government signs a new trade deal somewhere else. An investor sends money to a more stable environment. Each decision on its own seems tiny, but together they reshape the whole system. That's exactly why this moment is so significant, because it's not just about whether Canada wins this dispute or whether the United States proves its case. It's about whether the foundation of trust that holds all these relationships together stays solid or starts to crack. And here's where looking back at history matters. In the past, when the United States took aggressive economic action, its allies would complain and push back with words, but rarely actually changed anything structural about how they operated. There were arguments, but no real effort to build new alternatives. That's not the world we're in anymore. Today, the global economy is way more connected. Information travels instantly. Countries can coordinate faster. And most importantly, countries now have more options than ever. They don't have to stay inside a system that becomes unreliable. Which brings us to the most important shift happening right now. This is no longer just a back and forth between two countries. It's turning into a signal to the rest of the world, a signal about how power gets used, a signal about whether rules apply consistently, a signal about whether alliances mean anything real, beyond just what's convenient in the moment. And the world is watching extremely closely, because depending on how this whole thing plays out, it will shape decisions way beyond North America. If the United States doubles down, ignores the dispute process, and pushes forward without evidence, it locks in the idea that trade is now about power first and rules second. If Canada successfully challenges all of this through legal channels and forces the United States to back off, it sends the opposite message, that the system can still work, that agreements still have real weight. But right now, we're sitting right in the middle of that uncertainty. No resolution, no clear outcome, just two sides getting more locked into their positions while global attention keeps growing by the hour. And the longer this goes on, the harder it becomes to keep it contained. Because once a system starts losing trust, rebuilding that trust is 1,000 times harder than just keeping it in the first place, which means what happens next doesn't just decide how this particular fight ends, it decides how every future trade fight will be handled, and whether the rules that have kept global trade running for decades still carry real weight, or whether they're slowly being replaced by something else entirely.